In this video, we're going to talk about the history of the San Francisco Giants. They've got a long one, so buckle in and let's get to it. What is going on, everybody? Thanks for joining me back on my channel, Brutus on Baseball. This is the 12th edition of Major League Baseball team histories that I've put out there. I put a vote up just a couple weeks ago for some of the 4 hottest teams in baseball right now, and the easy winner was the San Francisco Giants. So if you don't see my community page, make sure you take a look next time so you can vote for your favorite team. So to get started, let's head all the way back to New York in the 1880s. The history of the Giants franchise is one of the longest in baseball, with their roots tracing back to the 1883 season when they first appeared as the New York Gothams in the National League. About half of the original team actually came from the Troy Trojans from upstate New York, a National League team that disbanded at the end of the 1882 season and whose place in the league the New York Gothams assumed in 1883. The team would play 2 seasons as the Gothams before switching to the Giants for the 1885 season for good. The franchise was started by tobacco tycoon John Day and former amateur player Jim Mutry, who also managed the team at the beginning. Day and Mutry simultaneously owned a team in the rival American Association as well, the New York Metropolitans, from 1882 to 1891. At first, they operated these teams separately, but by the late 1880s, the Metropolitans kind of became a funnel for the better players onto the National League Giants. The Giants would win their first National League pennant in 1888 behind Hall of Fame players like Tim Keefe, Roger Connor, Buck Ewing, and Mickey Welch. And they would go on to beat the American Association champions, the St. Louis Browns, who actually became the Cardinals later on. The Giants would repeat as National League champions again in 1889 with the same core, and they'd prevail again in the pre-modern era World Series against their soon-to-be arch-rival, the Brooklyn Bridegrooms, who would eventually become the Dodgers. The Giants were the best team in baseball in those late 1880 seasons, but most of their best players jumped ship before the 1890 season to the upstart Players League, which was created with the idea of wresting control away from team owners and back into the players' hands, as it had been before the advent of the first professional leagues. And as a result of this, the Giants suffered in 1890, finishing in 6th place, and the primary team owner, John Day, had taken a huge financial hit between losing his players and having to build a new stadium to play in at the same time, as well as having new competition. But the Players League would be hit really hard too, and the financial backers of the new league didn't have the stomach for losing money and abandoned the players. The Players League was therefore a bust, folding after only 1 season of play, and all those Giants players would return to the National League team. The other teams in the National League helped to bail Day out because of the financial difficulties. And due to that financial distress, Day ended up selling a stake of the team to Edward Talcott, who was the same guy that had been the principal backer of the New York team in the now disbanded Players League. The Giants rebounded in 1891 to 3rd place, but Day had lost the vast majority of ownership to Talcott and the other National League owners that bailed him out, so that eventually he was forced out and sold a controlling stake in the team to Talcott at the end of the 1891 season. The Giants would play well in the 1890s, even playing in the first Temple Cup series, which pitted the 2 best National League teams against each other for a championship from 1894 to 1897. And in that first Temple Cup in 1894, the Giants defeated the Baltimore Orioles with a sweep in 4 games. But even with that success, Talcott was also not seeing the profits, and now he wanted out. And he sold the principal ownership of the Giants by 1895 to Andrew Friedman, a New York real estate developer. But Friedman would be one of the most hated owners in baseball history, getting into squabbles with other owners, writers, and even his own players. The Giants' best pitcher in the 1890s was Amos Rusi, but after Friedman got into a dispute after offering him only $2,500 for the 1896 season, Rusi decided to sit out the entire year instead and didn't come back until the other owners had raised the money to pay him without Friedman's consent. But Friedman was independently wealthy beyond all the other owners in the league, and he took satisfaction in essentially running the Giants into the ground, making sure that they drew very few fans at their own gates or on the road. And eventually, the National League owners had to figure out a way to get him out. Andrew Friedman had one ally, though, in baseball by 1900, John T. Brush, the owner of the Cincinnati Reds. And together, Friedman and Brush bought controlling interest in a second team, the Baltimore Orioles of the American League, which they quickly sabotaged by releasing many of the team's best players in order to dismantle the best team in the upstart American League. There's a lot more to this story that I'll cover in another video for another team, but the impact on the Giants was that Friedman was able to convince a player manager by the name of John McGraw to jump ship from the Orioles to the Giants in 1902. And he brought several of the Orioles' best players along with him. McGraw would be the start of rebuilding the Giants baseball brand, and he'd manage the team for the next 30 years until 1932. But hiring McGraw would be one of the last moves that Friedman made as an owner, as he sold controlling interest in the Giants after the 1902 season to John T. Brush. McGraw would bring winning baseball to the Giants again, but after their first National League pennant in 1904, he and team owner John Brush refused to play against the American League pennant winners, the Boston Americans, who later became the Boston Red Sox. McGraw saw the American League as a lesser minor league and refused to play whoever won, since it was considered beneath the Giants. And as a result of the backlash over the refusal to play, Giants owner John Brush would agree to play in future years and was instrumental in developing the rules and the format of the World Series that would become an annual staple of the game. The Giants would beat the Philadelphia Athletics in the very next World Series in 1905, behind one of the most stellar World Series performances of all time, with Christy Mathewson pitching complete game shutouts in games 1, 3, and 5, for a total of 0 runs and 14 hits over 27 innings in the span of only 6 days. Their next battle for the playoffs would be in 1908, when the Giants found themselves tied for first place with the Chicago Cubs in the late days of September, in what is often called the most controversial game in baseball history. The Cubs and Giants found themselves tied at 1-1 in the bottom of the 9th inning. The Giants were batting with Moose McCormick on third base and rookie Fred Merkle on first base with 2 outs. The next batter singled to center field on the first pitch, sending McCormick home for the winning run. But almost immediately when the ball had left the bat, the New York fans had rushed the field to celebrate the victory. And Fred Merkle, who remember had been on first base, he saw this and decided to run off the field rather than going and tagging second base. Without the runner at first advancing to second base, there was still a force out in play that would actually trump the run scoring at home. So Cubs second baseman Johnny Evers saw that chance, and with the fans mobbing the field, he somehow got the center fielder to retrieve the ball and toss it to him at second base to force the third out of the inning, leaving the game tied at 1. But the game couldn't be continued, though, because of all those fans that had rushed the field, so the umpires called the game. By the last day of the season, the Cubs and Giants remained tied, and that game had to be rescheduled for October 8th, a game that the Cubs would win 4-2 and send the Giants home for the season. That base running gaffe by Merkle would forever be referred to as Merkle's boner. The Giants would continue with success, though, over the next several years, behind the stellar pitching of Christy Mathewson and Rube Marquardt, making the World Series each year from 1911 to 1913, but also losing all 3 of those times. During this time, the frail John T. Brush would pass away in November of 1912, but the team would remain in the Brush family, being passed down to his daughters and run on behalf of the family by appointed executor Harry Hempstead. The Giants would make the World Series again in 1917, but would lose once again, this time to the Chicago White Sox. But not long after, Hempstead had decided that the Brush family would be better off relinquishing control of the Giants and departing from baseball. He gathered enough support to sell the team to Manhattan stock trader Charles Stoneham just before the 1919 season. Stoneham was a financial professional by day, but a gambler and partier by night that often found himself in deep trouble. Soon after, the Giants would break through for Stoneham, though, behind a new core of young players in the early 1920s, including Frankie Frisch, Dave Bancroft, George High Pockets Kelly, and Ross Youngs, a group that would one day become known more for being some of the worst players selected to the Hall of Fame rather than one of the best teams of the early 1920s. They made 4 straight World Series appearances from 1921 to 1924, beating Babe Ruth and his Yankees in the first 2 of those series in 1921 and 1922. During this period in the Roaring '20s, team owner Charles Stoneham continued to find himself in more and more trouble, being indicted on more than one occasion for various accusations of fraud, theft, and other criminal charges in the financial world. He was eventually acquitted of most of those charges, with accusations of jury tampering not far behind, but lawsuits from defrauded investors and the associated legal bills continued to plague him, and the financial toll was eventually felt on the ball field too. As a result, the Giants lost steam heading into the mid to late 1920s, and the team played poorly. A new group of young players slugged their way onto the roster by the early 1930s, though, including one of their best players of all time, and one of the most criminally underrated players, at least in my opinion, in the history of the game, Mel Ott. He was joined by Bill Terry and Carl Hubble. John McGraw would hand over the reins for managing the team to player-manager Bill Terry, who would lead his team back to the World Series and win it all again in 1933, before returning twice more to the series in 1936 and 1937, but both of those times on the losing end to the Yankees. Charles Stoneham's health was also in decline in the mid-1930s, and his son Horace Stoneham had worked his way up through numerous jobs with the team, and was taking on more and more responsibility in the front office by that time. The elder Stoneham passed away quickly in early 1936, and upon his passing, it was discovered that he had an entire second family with a wife and 2 children that had been kept secret. But luckily for the team, his second wife laid no claim to the New York Giants, and ownership of the team was simply passed down to his son, Horace Stoneham, who at 32 was the youngest chief executive in Major League history. The Giants followed Stoneham's passing by cycling into another down period in the late 1930s and early 1940s. Bill Terry handed over the managing reins to Mel Ott in 1942, and by 1948 the managing duties were handed over to Leo Durocher, who skipped out mid-season where he was managing the crosstown Dodgers to take over the helm for the Giants. Durocher would immediately start rebuilding the team, and behind him, the Giants would again become relevant after missing the playoffs every year between 1938 and 1950. And behind Durocher, they would produce some of the team's most memorable moments. It began with the 1951 season, in which the Giants found themselves 13 and a half games behind their arch-rival, the Brooklyn Dodgers, in August. But the team went on an absolute tear, winning 16 in a row at one point and finishing the season by winning their last 7 straight and tying the Dodgers on the last day of the season. At that time, there was a 3-game series that was played to decide which team would move on to face the Yankees in the World Series. The Giants took Game 1, and the Dodgers, of course, took Game 2, setting up the inevitable final game of the season. Winner goes to the World Series, loser goes home. The Dodgers were up 4-1 going into the bottom of the 9th inning, and the Giants managed to plate 1 run in that inning, bringing up Bobby Thompson with runners at first and third. Thompson would rip a 1-ball, 1-strike pitch that just barely scraped over the left field fence for a 3-run home run, as Thompson leaped around the bases and was swarmed at home plate by teammates and fans alike. His swing won the game for the Giants and became known as the shot heard around the world. Although the Giants would go on to lose the World Series to the Yankees, the season was fondly remembered as a victory because this scrappy Giants team that shouldn't have been there managed to knock out the most hated rival, the Dodgers. After a couple down seasons without their budding star Willie Mays after that, who would join the Army and miss the 1952 and 1953 seasons while in the Korean War, the Giants would reach the World Series again in 1954 when Mays returned, and this time they would sweep the heavily favored Cleveland Indians for their 5th World Series victory, behind Willie Mays, Monty Irvin, Al Dark, and Hoyt Wilhelm. This series provided Giants fans with yet another of those really memorable moments. Willie Mays tracking down a long fly ball off the bat of Vic Wertz with his back turned to home plate the entire time. Simply known as the catch, this incredible play was made about 450 feet from home plate in the cavernous Polo Grounds and kept the game tied in the 8th inning with 2 runners on base. But things were about to change for the Giants of New York. Over the 1940s and 1950s, the Polo Grounds had been deteriorating, and the neighborhood around it had become more questionable, less desirable. The Giants had become a distant 3rd place in drawing fans behind the Yankees and Dodgers in New York City. Horace Stoneham didn't own the lands that the Polo Grounds were built on, so investing in maintenance or renovations was difficult. The landowners had slated the Polo Grounds to be demolished and replaced by a housing development as well in the late 1950s, so the Giants went looking for land to build a new stadium. But the idea of keeping the team's home in Manhattan was near impossible with the limitations on land available. Stoneham didn't think New York could support 3 teams any longer anyway, and so he began looking elsewhere for a new home. First, considering Minneapolis, Minnesota, the home of the Giants' top farm team in AAA that Stoneham also owned, and therefore it gave them first rights for relocation. But then in walked Walter O'Malley, owner of the Brooklyn Dodgers, who had been in discussions with the city of Los Angeles to be the first to move a major league team out west. The National League was not willing to approve the move of the Dodgers to the West Coast, primarily citing concerns about travel logistics and costs, and so they told O'Malley that they would not approve the move unless a second team would move out west with them. So O'Malley approached Stoneham and convinced him and the city of San Francisco to come to the table together and reach an agreement that would see the Giants move out west to the Bay Area, which also meant that O'Malley got the approval he needed to move his Dodgers to LA to start the 1958 season. It shocked the baseball world, especially fans in New York, by moving 2 of the most historic franchises and suddenly leaving the Yankees as the only team left in New York City. The Giants were able to move into San Francisco almost immediately because the city had supported a team in the Pacific Coast League, the San Francisco Seals, for several decades. The first decade and a half in the Bay Area were fairly successful years behind a core group of future Hall of Fame players like Willie Mays, Willie McCovey, Orlando Cepeda, Juan Marichal, and Gaylord Perry. But with all that incredible talent, they only managed to make 1 World Series appearance, losing to the Yankees again in 1962. But there were a number of issues on the horizon that started to impact the younger Stoneham, who had inherited the Giants from his father. The first of which was the move of the Kansas City Athletics to Oakland, a move which Stoneham felt was a direct threat to his Giants, as he didn't think that the Bay Area could support 2 teams. It didn't help that Candlestick Park was in a remote location of the city that wasn't easy to access, and the A's brought with them an incredible team that made the playoffs 5 straight years from 1971 to 1975, including 3 World Series victories from 72 to 74. The Giants felt the squeeze almost immediately, seeing their attendance cut in half almost every season in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Stoneham realized that with an aging team and less revenue being brought in, he would have to start shedding his veteran players. One by one, Cepeda was first traded to the Cardinals in 1966. Gaylord Perry was sent to Cleveland in 71, and in 1973, Willie McCovey was sent to San Diego, and Juan Marichal was sent to Boston. But what put the nail in the coffin for Stoneham was realizing he would have to part ways with Willie Mays, who he tried his best to trade as respectfully as he could to a comfortable setting. As one of the best players in history, spent his last couple seasons back in New York playing with the Mets. With his team gutted and no money coming in, Stoneham had to approach the National League in early 1975 to ask for a loan to keep his team afloat. After 57 years with one family, the Giants were for sale again. He waited for local buyers, but almost a year later, the only offer he had was from Labatt Brewing Company, who wanted to relocate the Giants to Toronto before the Blue Jays existed. But that's when the mayor of San Francisco took up the cause to keep the Giants in his city. And he put together a deal between businessmen Bob Lurie and Bob Short that would do just that. But the National League voted against Bob Short based on his previous ownership difficulties with the Texas Rangers. It seemed that the Giants were destined for Toronto when out of nowhere came a cattle rancher from Arizona named Bud Herseth. He called the mayor's office to express his interest in helping to buy the team with Lurie and keep it in San Francisco. And in a matter of hours, the deal was done and the Giants would be staying. The partnership between Lurie and Herseth would only last a handful of years, and the Giants would hover between mediocre and poor from the mid-1970s to the mid-1980s, when they lost 100 games, the worst season in franchise history, and the only time the team has lost 100 games in a season, in 1985. The Giants somehow made a big comeback to competitiveness in the late 1980s with another young core that included Will Clark, Kevin Mitchell, and Matt Williams, and they made the playoffs again in 1987 and 1989 when they met the Oakland A's in the World Series in a Battle of the Bay. But the Giants were swept in 4 games during that series, with a 10-day interruption in play due to the Loma Prieta earthquake that happened just as Game 3 was about to be kicked off at Candlestick Park. But the Giants weren't a great team to really be there and be competitive, and the attendance and stadium left a lot to be desired. Bob Lurie started campaigning for a new stadium in the city, but was shot down 4 different times by the local voters. So he then started shopping for a new location to move the team again. And by mid-1992, Lurie had a deal with a group of buyers that would move the team to Tampa Bay to start the 1993 season. While Tampa celebrated the announcement, San Francisco exploded with anger. Once again, the mayor at the time stepped in to plead with the National League to give him time to find owners that would keep the team in San Francisco. The National League gave him 3 weeks. And in that time, a whole consortium of business leaders in San Francisco came together to fund the purchase of the franchise, led by chairman of Safeway, Peter McGowan. The National League owners met and voted against the move to Tampa anyway, meaning that Lurie was free to accept the local offer, which he did, and it was easily approved by Major League Baseball. Wanting to make a big splash right away, the new ownership group behind McGowan agreed to terms with Barry Bonds in the most lucrative contract up to that time to bring the outfielder to the Giants even before the sale had been finalized. The new ownership group did what they could to spruce up Candlestick Park, but they knew they had to find a new home eventually. Behind Barry Bonds and eventually bringing in Jeff Kent in 1997, the Giants became a force to be reckoned with again by the mid-1990s, making the playoffs in 97, 2000, 2002, and 2003, including another World Series appearance in 2002, where they likely should have won, but eventually lost out to the Anaheim Angels this time. 2 things happened during that time period. First, they opened their new waterfront ballpark at McCovey Cove in 2000, which is often thought to be one of the most beautiful stadiums to play in the history of baseball. And of course, number 2 was Barry Bonds happened, who had one of the most dominant runs in baseball history, winning a record 7 MVP awards, including 5 with the Giants and 4 in a row between 2001 and 2004. He was unstoppable during that time, finishing with an on-base percentage over 500 in those 4 years, including a career-high 609 on-base percentage in 2004. And of course, beyond that, he broke the single-season home run record in 2001 with 73 bombs, and Hank Aaron's all-time record with 762 in his final season in 2007. But all of those historic numbers come with strings attached, of course, as he was accused in the Balco scandal of taking steroids. But no team signed him in 2008, including the Giants, although he was easily still one of the best hitters in baseball. He has since been ostracized from the game, and he's been shut out of the Hall of Fame voting each attempt since his retirement. A very unfortunate end to one of the best careers of all time. The reason the Giants didn't retain Bonds past 2007 was because the roster had gotten old again. Several significant signings hadn't worked out, like Barry Zito, and they decided to go into rebuild mode. It wouldn't take long at all. Behind a young Buster Posey that led an incredible starting rotation of Tim Lincecum, Madison Bumgarner, and Matt Cain, the Giants made the playoffs again in the even years of 2010, 2012, 2014, and 2016, reaching and winning the World Series in each of the first 3 of those years, and finally bringing home the championship for the first time in 53 seasons since the team had moved to San Francisco. So, looking through all of that history, the Giants have been to the playoffs a total of 26 times out of 123 seasons. And that's not counting the Temple Cup win in 1894 and the 2 pre-World Series championships in 1888 and 1889. They have represented the National League in the World Series a total of 20 times, winning 8 of those times, which is tied for 4th all-time with their arch-rival, the Dodgers. Now, let's talk a bit more detail about ballpark history. The Gothams and the Giants initially played their home in the Polo Grounds, a pitch that was actually built for playing polo in Harlem, just north of Central Park in Upper Manhattan. This initial stadium, though, wasn't actually named the Polo Grounds. It was just referred to as such because that's the sport it was actually built for. But the Giants were kicked out of the first home after the 1888 season, as the stadium would be demolished to make way for the expansion of Manhattan north of Central Park. The Giants bounced around at different parks to start 1889 and had to play temporarily further north in Harlem for the second half of 1889 and 1890 seasons at a field that they again carried over the name Polo Grounds for, until their more permanent home was finally constructed in 1891 at what most people know of as the Polo Grounds at the foot of Coogan's Bluff in Washington Heights. The Polo Grounds were actually built for the New York Giants of the Players League in 1890, but when that league disbanded and the Players returned to the National League in 1891, the Giants took over the stadium as well as the Players. And they would play there until they moved from New York to San Francisco after the 1957 season. The Polo Grounds was a very unusual stadium in that it almost had the shape of a horseshoe or a bathtub, with very short distances down both foul lines at approximately 279 and 258 feet, and a very deep center field of 450 feet in the gaps and up to 483 feet in straightaway center field. This shape is what allowed the shot heard around the world by Bobby Thompson to happen in 1951 due to the short left field, and where the catch was made by Willie Mays in 1954, making it even more impressive that he was able to track down a fly ball that would have been a home run in almost every other modern park in the league. After the teams moved to San Francisco, they played for 2 seasons at Seals Stadium, the former home of the San Francisco Seals. The Giants moved into Candlestick Park in 1960, located on Candlestick Point overlooking San Francisco Bay, a stadium that was known for its high winds, its evening fog, and cold weather throughout their time there. The Giants put up with Candlestick Park for 4 decades, being turned down time and again by the residents of San Francisco for permission to build a new ballpark despite those several attempts to move the team, until finally the team overwhelmingly received the support they needed to build the current Oracle Park, formerly Pac Bell Park and AT&T Park, much closer to downtown, and it was open for play for that 2000 season. The opening of the new ballpark reinvigorated the fan base and made it an absolute joy to watch baseball in San Francisco and helped propel the Giants back into relevancy. The Giants' uniforms and logos have remained fairly consistent through their 2 periods of history, with the color schemes being the major changes over time, at least in the beginning. The earliest uniforms often featured New York in big block lettering across the jersey. The NY logo first started being featured around 1905, while the interlocking NY logo that became famous for the team started circa 1908, and the Giants name appearing mostly on road jerseys in the late 1910s. The team went through some variations in jerseys, including black jerseys in the mid to late 1900s and blue plaid jerseys in the mid-1910s. Their logos and their trim colors changed regularly, from red in the early 1910s and mid-20s to violet in the mid-1910s, blue in the late 1910s to early 20s and late 20s, and finally the black and orange that's common now in the mid-1930s. The team even wore red, white, and blue uniforms for a short time to support the war effort during World War II in the early to mid-1940s. But after the late 1940s, the team changed back to the black and orange color scheme and haven't deviated since. Of course, swapping the interlocking NY for the SF in 1958, but not changing much else since. The few notable exceptions were the cursive Giants writing on the jersey rather than the block lettering for the first time in the 1970s, plus adding in all black home jerseys with orange trim and orange road jerseys with black trim, which are still used as alternates occasionally. The Giants have a rich history of players winning awards, including 11 that have won Rookie of the Year, a long list of 15 MVP winners, but only 3 Cy Young awards. The list of MVP winners is much smaller though when you account for Barry Bonds winning 5 of those himself in 1993 and each year from 2001 to 2004. In addition to Bonds, MVP awards have also gone to Larry Doyle in 1912, Bill Terry in 1930, Carl Hubble as a pitcher in 1933 and 1936, Willie Mays in 1954 and 1965, Willie McCovey in 1969, Kevin Mitchell in 1989, Jeff Kent in 2000, and Buster Posey in 2012. The Cy Young Award winners include Mike McCormick in 1967 and Tim Lincecum back-to-back in 2008 and 2009. A total of 56 players or managers in the Hall of Fame represent the Giants' franchise history, including 43 players that primarily played while in New York and 13 that primarily played or managed in San Francisco. A total of 19 players are in the Hall of Fame wearing a New York cap, while 5 players in the Hall of Fame wear a San Francisco hat, including Willie Mays, Willie McCovey, Orlando Cepeda, Juan Marichal, and Gaylord Perry, all from that 1960s core. The next Giants player that will be elected to the Hall of Fame is either Carlos Beltran, who played only a half season for the Giants, or Buster Posey, who will be first eligible in 2027. After those two, you'd have to look at currently active players, although there aren't actually many. Justin Verlander will be on that list now that he's signed for what could be his final season with San Francisco. Looking back, there aren't too many guys that could get voted in through the Classic Era Committee. Maybe Bill Dolan from way back in the early days of the New York Giants. The Giants players that have the best shot from the Contemporary Committee would be the powerhouse duo of Barry Bonds and Jeff Kent, although I think Jeff Kent's chances are much better in next year's vote compared to Bonds, who I think will get in eventually, but may have to wait several more voting cycles. I would love to see Will Clark get more consideration, especially since he retired while still at the top of his game after posting a 145 OPS plus at the age of 36. But he shockingly didn't last beyond his first ballot with only 4.4% of the vote, and hasn't shown very well in the 2 Veterans Committee ballots that he's been on since. The list of best players in Giants history has a lot of really tremendous names, making it incredibly difficult to choose a top 5. I would go with Willie Mays at number 1, who played the vast majority of his career with the Giants across New York and San Francisco, and finished with 660 home runs, a 155 OPS plus, and 156 WAR, even losing 2 of his prime years to military service. Barry Bonds would be number 2, who finished with better numbers than Mays, but he has to deal with those steroid allegations, so that drops him down a spot in my book, at least 1 spot. And then third, I'd put Mel Ott, who played his entire 22-year career with the Giants, but's often forgotten about among the game's historic sluggers of that era, even though he finished with 511 home runs, a 155 OPS plus, and 111 WAR. In fourth, I would put Willie McCovey, who played 19 years in San Francisco and hit 521 career home runs. And for the 5th spot, I would pick Roger Connor, one of the original stars of the Giants, who played first base from the 1880s and 1890s, and was a better overall player than McCovey, but gets docked just a bit because he only played 10 of his 18 seasons with the Giants. The list of best pitchers of all time for the Giants franchise would look like this. Number 1, Christy Mathewson, who won 373 games while playing almost his entire career with the Giants in the 1900s and 1910s. Number 2, Carl Hubbell, who pitched his entire career for the Giants of the 1930s and 40s. Number 3, Juan Marichal, who pitched 14 of his 16 seasons for the Giants in the 60s and 70s, and was the first pitcher to be elected to the Hall of Fame from the Dominican Republic. Number 4, I'd pick Amos Rusi, who somehow accumulated 234 wins with a 137 ERA plus and 66 WAR in only 8 seasons with the Giants, before retiring early due to arm trouble and getting hit in the head with a line drive. And then rounding it out with number 5, it was a tough choice to pick this spot. Tim Lincecum was phenomenal at the top of his game, winning back-to-back Cy Young Awards, and so was Madison Bumgarner, especially in the playoffs. But I would have to go with the often forgotten Mickey Welch, who was also an original Giant that essentially spent his entire 13-year Hall of Fame career with the same team, and accumulating 307 career wins with 63 WAR. Smiling Mickey, as was his nickname due to his cheerful disposition, was a Giant for life, even returning to the team to work as an usher at the Polo Grounds when he was in his 60s. So there you have it, the entire history of the New York and now San Francisco Giants. We'll see how the Giants do in 2025 and if they're able to keep this hot streak going. As always, keep talking baseball, take care of yourselves, and we'll see you around.